everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Brittany of BrittanyJJones.com. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome to my channel. I hope that you will like what you see and subscribe below for more. In today's video, we are going to be sewing. It's another sew video. We're going to be sewing along to Butterick 6554. I love the way this wrap dress came together. I followed View B on this pattern. Overall, the dress came together really easy. I didn't have any problems constructing it. The only time-consuming part was attaching the flounce, creating that where you had to create the narrow hem for it and attach it to the skirt. That was the most time-consuming part of this dress, but everything else came together easy. I do want to make a correction because I said in the preview video that I was going to cut the size 18. I actually cut the size 16 for the full dress, so it's a 16 bust, 16 waist, and 16 hips, and I love the way it fits. So I just wanted to make sure I corrected that. If you missed the preview video where I talked about the fabric that I purchased, the supplies and notions that I purchased and will be using, definitely check that video out there. I went over all of that as well as opened up the instructions and went through the instructions in that video. So once you have all of your pattern pieces cut out, you cut out all your fabric, you transfer your markings, let's start sewing. To begin sewing, I'm going to take my front bodice, which is piece number 1, and I'm going to go ahead and sew down my darts. So if you did not transfer your dart legs, you want to go ahead and do that now and grab some pins, and let's go ahead and pin our darts out. Once you have your dart pinned, go ahead and pin your other bodice dart out the same exact way, and now we can go to our machine and go ahead and stitch them down. Once you have the darts sewn, we can go ahead and press them down. So I have my ironing board here. After we have the darts sewn and pressed down, we can go ahead and put our bodice fronts to the side. And now we can grab our ties. So I have my right tie as well as my left tie. I'm gonna go ahead and do both of them at the same time since the steps are back to back. But what we're gonna do is the shorter one is the right tie. So we're gonna fold it right sides facing, lengthwise, and the side that has the dots, you should have transferred 3 dots on one of the ends. We're gonna leave that end open so we'll be able to flip it right side out, but we're gonna stitch 5/8 of an inch all the way down and across the edge that doesn't have the dots. So again, leave the side with the dots open and stitch all the way down and across the other end, and we're gonna do the same exact thing for the left tie as well. Now that I have both of my ties sewn, I'm going to go ahead and trim them down. I'm going to trim the other tie the same way and then flip them right side out. Now that I have the ties turned right side out, I'm going to go ahead and give them a good press. So now that we have both of the ties sewn, turned right side out, and pressed, I'm going to go ahead to the machine now and just baste across the raw edge that we left open where the markings are. I'm just going to baste right across that now. Okay, so I've just basted across those raw edges on the ties. So now we're going to go ahead and pin them to our bodice. So this one right here, this is my left front bodice. I'm going to grab my right front bodice here. So on the right bodice, right here along the front opening, we're going to take the right tie, and that is the shorter tie. And I'm going to match up my 2 markings right here with the 2 markings on the right front opening. I'm going to match those up, make sure that I match up the raw edges as well, and just pin there in place. So now I'm going to take my left bodice and I'm going to pin the left tie the same way, matching up the markings, lining up the raw edges along the front opening. Now that we have the ties pinned on, we can go ahead to our machine and go ahead and baste right across them now. Okay, so I have the ties basted onto the front opening edges of both of the bodices. So the next step is to sew our back to our front pieces along the side seams. But before I do that, first I'm going to go ahead and finish off my seams separately. So I'm just going to serge down my side seams on my front as well as my back pieces. And I'm also going to put a little bit of interfacing right here at these dots where we need to leave it open for the ties to go through. So for the right side only, I'm going to interface the back as well as the front right here between these markings that we're going to leave open so we'll be able to slide our ties through. And I have a little bit of interfacing here. I'm just going to cut a small piece of this and just fuse it right here a little bit past these dots, again just to stabilize that area since we will be pulling the ties through. So I'm going to go ahead and stabilize it now. Okay, so now I'm going to take it to the iron. I'm just going to put this interfacing right over those markings now. All right, so I have my interfacing applied, and again, it's just to add a little bit of stability to this opening edge. So now I'm going to go ahead and finish off my side seams separately, come back, pin it together, and then we can stitch it. So I'm going to go do that now. So now with my side seams finished, I can go ahead and pin the side seams together now, right sides facing. For the right side, we're going to pin to the first dot. Make sure that we leave it open between those markings that we transferred, and then pin at the second dot. So then when we sew, we'll start at the top, we'll stitch to the first dot, make sure that you back stitch at the beginning and the end. We'll leave this part open and then begin stitching right here at the second dot to the end of the bodice. So that's what we would do on the right side. For the left side, we would just stitch completely down. So now that we have the side seams pinned, we can go ahead and stitch them now. Okay, so I have the side seams sewn, and you can see I went ahead and pressed them open flat. So now over here on the right side, where we have those markings with that opening that we left open, so here's my opening for my tie to go through. We need to create a narrow hem around here, and we're going to stitch up the narrow hem, pivot across 1/4 inch above the large circle, and then go ahead and stitch down. So since our seam was already pressed at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, we can just fold in the raw edge to the inside to create the narrow hem like so. So now we can just stitch up along this pressed edge, pivot 1/4 inch above that large circle, the top one, and then continue stitching all the way down. Now for me, since I already have my side seams finished, I'm okay with leaving them open like this, so I'm not going to fold in the raw edge. I'm just going to sew straight up the side, pivot across, and come right back down. So here is a closer look at my stitching along the opening edge, and I just used my serger stitch as a guide. So I just stitched right along that side and pivoted over and then continued to stitch down. So this is what my opening edge looks like. You go ahead and stitch around yours the same way. All right, now that we have stitched along this opening edge, we can go ahead and put our front and back pieces to the side and start working on our sleeve. So here are my two sleeves. This is piece 5 and this is piece 6. Before I put them together right sides facing and sew them, I'm going to take it to my serger and go ahead and finish off the edges. So then after I have it sewn, I can just press the seam open flat. So I'm going to finish off the edges right now with my serger. Okay, so I have the seams finished off right here on my front sleeve and my back. So now I'm going to go ahead and put right sides together. Okay, once you have both of your sleeve seams pinned, we can go ahead and stitch them at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have your shoulder seams sewn, you want to go ahead and press them open. Now we can move on to the next step. Next, we're going to go ahead and pin our sleeves to our bodice. So go ahead and grab your front and back, and with right sides facing, I'm going to go ahead and find the right sleeve. So the one notch goes to the front and the double notch goes to the back. So I'm going to line up my side seams here and pin in place. Okay, so once you have both of the sleeves pinned right sides facing to the bodice, we can go to the machine and stitch them at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you want to stitch again at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I am also going to finish off my seam with my serger. So let's go ahead and do all the sewing now. Okay, so I have my sleeve seam sewn. I've also finished off my edges with my serger. So now I'm going to press the seam toward the sleeve. So I'm gonna grab my iron. Alright, so now that I have my seam right here for the sleeve, I have it pressed toward the sleeve. The next step is to go ahead and stitch the overarm seam of the sleeve together. And I went ahead and finished off that seam, finished off both of those seams with my serger. So now I can just put them together and match up my notch and pin the sleeve closed. I know things are kind of looking crazy right now, but hopefully after we stitch this seam, our bodice will start to take shape. Once you have your overarm seam pinned, we can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that I have the overarm seam sewn, I'm going to go ahead and press that flat. Press it open. Okay, now that I have the overarm seam pressed open, now I'm going to create a narrow hem along the edge of the sleeve. Just let me cut these loose threads off. So I have my seam gauge here. First I'm going to turn up 5/8 of an inch. And I'm going to press that first. And then once I have the 5/8 of an inch pressed, I'm going to go back and fold in the raw edges to create the narrow hem. So I'm going to go all the way around my sleeve, pressing up 5/8 of an inch. Once you have your narrow hem created on the edge of your sleeve, now we can take it to our machine and just stitch close to this inner pressed edge. So let's go ahead and do our hem now. Alright, so our bodice is starting to take shape. I just finished the hem on the lower edge of our sleeve for both of the sleeves. So I have my hems done. The next step, we're gonna do a little bit of stay stitching, but we're gonna do it at 1/4 inch instead of at 1/2 inch seam allowance. So between these large circles that we have transferred, and mines are right here beside this seam, we're going to do a 1/4 inch stitch just to keep this back neckline from stretching out. So let's go ahead and just stitch from circle to circle at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I just stitched the 1/4 inch around the back neckline of the bodice. So I'm going to put this to the side, and now we can start working on the facing. So I have my facing pieces right here, and you can see I've already fused them with interfacing. So before we can pin and sew these onto the bodice, we need to finish off this unnotched edge, as well as this top edge for the shoulder area will be. I'm just going to finish this off with my serger, and then I'm going to press the serge over, which would just be about 1/4 inch, and then I will stitch that down. Okay, so I have the unnotched edge as well as this shoulder edge of my facing finished. So now we'll go ahead and grab our bodice, and working on the front opening edge, I'm going to take right sides facing, match up the notch, and pin in place. So now that we have it pinned, I'm going to pin my other facing the same way, and I'm going to start right up here at the top of the facing and stitch all the way down to the end. So let's go ahead and stitch our facing on now. So now that we have our facing sewn on, I'm going to go ahead and trim it down just a little. I'm not going to come up here just yet. I'm going to wait till after we do the bias tape, then I will trim a little bit more. Same thing for the other side. Okay, so I have trimmed a little bit off of the facing. So now I'm going to take my package of single fold bias tape. Just going to open this out. And we need to cut a piece that extends 3/8 inch on both sides of the neckline. So I'm just going to roughly measure this over around the neckline and make sure I cut it a little bit longer. Before we sew it, I'm going to lightly just press one side of it so that it is open. Okay, so I have one side of it lightly pressed. So now I'm going to go ahead and pin this facing along the 5/8 inch stitching line. So this fold right here on the bias tape, I'm going to put this on the 5/8 inch seam allowance. So the fabric and the bias tape will not be even. This will be down along the 5/8 inch seam line. We will have this excess sticking out from our back neckline. So I'm going to go ahead and grab some pins to pin this in place. Okay, so now that I have it pinned on, you can see it is extending again, and it's only on this back neck edge. Now I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to stitch right in this pressed fold that we lightly pressed open. I'm going to stitch right in there along the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so here's how my back neckline is looking right now, and I have that bias tape stitched right in that first fold on this along the seam line. So now we can go ahead and trim this seam allowance down to the bias tape. I'm going to go ahead and trim this excess off that I left for the facing as well. Since now everything is all even, I can just trim that off. So now I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to do understitching along the facing as well as the bias tape. I'm going to make sure that I have the seam allowance facing the facing and the bias tape. And I'm going to go ahead and do stitching all the way around the back neckline and along this front facing. Do understitching now. Okay, so now that we have the bias tape as well as the front facing understitch, I've gone ahead and pressed it to the inside. So now I'm going to baste close to this inner pressed edge on the bias tape, and then on the outside, I'm going to stitch following along with the basting stitch. Okay, now that I have the bias tape sewn and I've also tacked down my facing right here to this seam allowance, now we can put our bodice to the side and start working on our skirt. To begin working with our skirts, we're going to start with piece 12, which is our back piece, and we are going to pin and stitch down our center back seam. You can see I've gone ahead and finished off that seam, so once I have it sewn, I can just press it open flat. So I'm going to pin the side that has the 3 notches together. So one side has double notches, the other side has 3. I'm going to line up my notches and the seams and go ahead and pin the center back seam in place. Now that I have it pinned, I'm going to take it to the machine and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that I have the center back seam sewn, I'm going to go ahead and press the seam. Now that I have the seam pressed, I can go ahead and grab my skirt front pieces. So here are my front skirt pieces. This is piece 13, and I've gone ahead, I finished off those side seams as well with my serger. So now with right sides facing, here's my back. I'm gonna go ahead and put my front right sides facing to the back, match up those side seams. And those notches should have double notches up here on the sides. And pin in place. I have one side pinned. I'm going to go ahead and pin the other side seam the same way. Then I'm going to take it to the machine and stitch it in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that I have the fronts sewn to the backs at the side seams, I'm going to go ahead and press those seams open. Now that we have all of the seams of the skirt pressed, now we can go to the machine and do stay stitching along the upper edge of the skirt. Stay stitching is usually done at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but for this project, we're going to stay stitch at an 1/8 of an inch. So let's go ahead and do that stay stitching now. Alright, so I have the stay stitching done along the upper edge of the skirt. So now I'm going to put the skirt pieces to the side and grab the front and back flounce pieces. Okay, so I have my 2 flounce pieces. Here's my piece 14 and here's 15. So I am going to put the side seams right sides facing and go ahead and pin and stitch them together. You can see I've gone ahead and finished off these seam allowances as well. So once they're sewn, I can just press them open. So with right sides facing, I'm going to go ahead and match up my notches and pin in place. Now once you have both of the sides pinned, right side is facing, we can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so I have the sides of my flounces sewn together, so I'm going to go ahead and press those open. Now that I have the side sewn, I'm going to take it to the machine. I'm going to do stay stitching this inner circle of the flounce where the notches are. I'm going to stay stitch at an 1/8 of an inch, and then along this outer edge, along the hem side, I'm going to stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we have a couple long stitches to do, but again, I'm going to do the stay stitching at an 1/8 of an inch along this notched edge, and along the hem of the flounce, I'm going to do a 1/2 inch stitch. That's going to be our guide to form our narrow hem. So after we have it stitched at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then we're going to press up along that 1/2 inch. We'll trim it down, and then we're going to fold over again to create a really, really baby narrow hem. So let's go ahead and do the 1/8 of an inch stay stitch along the notched edge, and then stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the hem. Okay, I am back. That took a long time, but I have the stay stitching done at an 1/8 of an inch along the notched edge, and then I have sewn at a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the hem of the flounce. So now that I have that 1/2 inch stitch as a guide, now I'm going to go ahead and press up along that stitch. Okay, so I just pressed up the hem along that 1/2 inch stitch that we made. So now we're gonna grab our scissors and trim close to that stitch that we created. So let me get to the beginning here. I'm gonna grab my scissors and I'm just gonna stitch, I'm just going to trim close to this stitch. So you can see how tiny I am trimming, and once we have it trimmed, then we'll be able to fold that over to create the baby narrow hem. If you have a narrow hem foot, this is the time to pull that out. But if you don't, then let's just go ahead and trim this really close to this stitch all the way along the hem. Okay, y'all, so I have it all trimmed, and I started off really thin here with my trim, and I did go a little bit wider as I was going on. So now what we're gonna do is just gonna fold in right on that 1/2 inch seam allowance and just pressing it down. So I'm just going to continue turning in and pressing all the way around this flounce. So let's go ahead and do that now. So once you have pressed in along that trimmed edge, we can go to the machine now. We're going to stitch close to this inner pressed edge. So let's go ahead and do our stitching now. All right, y'all, so I have the narrow hem formed along the lower edge of the flounce. And so now we can go ahead and pin this to the skirt. So let's grab our skirt pieces. Okay, here's my skirt, and with right sides facing, we are going to pin our flounce to our skirt. Okay, so I have my flounce pinned along the hem of the skirt, right sides facing. So now I'm going to go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to stitch it again at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Remember, if you need to, you can clip into your flounce right up to that stay stitching to stretch it to get a little bit more room so that it can fit with the skirt. So once you have yours all pinned, let's go ahead and stitch it now. All right, so I have my flounce sewn. It feels so good to be done. I'm gonna go ahead and give that a good press, but first I'm going to create a narrow hem along the front opening edges. You can see here that I carried on my serge all the way up here along the opening edge of the skirt. So we're just gonna create a narrow hem. So I'm just gonna fold this in. I'm gonna grab my iron so I can press it. So now that I have the narrow hem formed, I'm going to go ahead and stitch it down close to this inner pressed edge on both of the front openings. Okay, so I just formed the narrow hem along the front edges of the skirt. So now we're going to go ahead and pin the skirt to the bodice, right sides facing. So we need to match up all of our seams as well as our notches. So I have my pins here. Okay, so I have my bodice pinned to my skirt along the waist seam. Now right here for our facing piece here, we are going to wrap this facing around the seam so that it is going around the skirt. You want to make sure that you keep your ties out of the way, so make sure that they are down. I'm going to match up this seam, make sure that it is right there beside each other, and then I'm going to fold the facing around, making sure I have the raw edges even and making sure that the ties are out of the way. And then I'm just going to pin that in place. We can go ahead and base our seam, make sure that we have our ties and everything out of the way. And once the stitch is good, then we can go back and stitch it along that basting at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then stitch again at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do our stitching now. Okay, so I just sewed my waist seam together and I also finished the seam off with my serger. So now we can go ahead and turn our facing to the inside and pull out our ties. So once you turn your facing out, it should be nice and clean on the inside of your dress like this. Go ahead and turn the other side out the same way. So now we can go ahead and give our facings a press, and we are all done with our new wrap dress. Thank you all so much for joining me for another Sew With Me video. If you have any questions, please leave them down for me below. I'll be more than happy to answer. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. Blessings, everyone. Bye.